Welcome to the last video in the Orientation to Clinical Research series. In this video, we're going to cover publishing the results of your research. You may be familiar with the publishing process, but if not, this video is to give you an introduction to just how the process goes, what the structure of a scientific paper is, and how to submit and revise your publication. Now, first thing to know is that we tend to think of a scientific paper as what is known as the original research study, but there are actually other types of scientific papers. In clinical medicine, you may be familiar with the case report or the case series. This is a report on one or a few cases that are unique or had some other interesting findings that you want to report to the world. This can actually be an extremely helpful format of paper. The first paper describing HIV was actually a case report, well, a case series. There are also what's called short communications, although not every journal has these. Short communications are research articles that are much shorter. These are often used for very simple projects or for projects where the findings were minimal at best, often because sample size was low or because the findings were limited. The original research paper is the typical paper, and we'll be spending most of our time on that. Now, review articles are not the systematic reviews or scoping reviews. Those are research, but review articles are the narrative reviews that we talked about in the literature review section. So review articles are a way to provide an overview of a particular topic within a field. The editorial is also sometimes called commentary, and it's what it says. It's an editorial. It's opinion, not fact. So in all of the other types of scientific papers, you are aiming for supported factual reporting. In an editorial, you can provide an opinion, which can be highly useful if you have a strong opinion on a topic and you want to share it with the world, but you cannot necessarily provide evidence to support that. It's especially helpful if you want to advocate for a certain type of research or a certain research topic to be covered in more depth or in a different way. And then finally, correspondence are the letters to the editor that you might be familiar with from newspapers. But in correspondence, it's usually a letter responding to a particular paper that the author of the correspondence thought there was something overlooked, or there might be something that they thought was left out that they wanted to comment on. In many journals, if you have written a paper and somebody writes a letter about your paper, they will give you a chance to respond to that letter before they publish it. So they will publish the letter and the response together. That's very helpful if the person is criticizing something in your paper and you want to set the record straight on why what you did was appropriate, or to say that that was a good criticism and that you have found a problem and you have fixed it. So correspondence, it's not peer-reviewed, but it does allow the author generally a chance to respond. Now, when we're talking about the original research paper, and to a lesser extent the short communication, there is a standard structure. It begins with the abstract, then the introduction, the methods, the results, the discussion, and then the conclusion. The conclusion is not always separate from the discussion, and there are journals in which the methods are put after the conclusion, after the references. I am personally not a fan of those because I think the method should be read before the results, but that is a way that some people do it. In this structure, the abstract is usually a page or less, most often just one paragraph, that gives you an overview of the entire paper, whereas the introduction gives you the background necessary to understand why the study is being done and what the hole in the literature is that it is filling. The methods are telling you what was done, the results are telling you what was found. The discussion is placing the results in the context of the literature and of what we know in science. So the introduction and the discussion are often bringing in citations from a number of different sources, And then the conclusion is going back to what is the big takeaway from the entire study and what are the implications for clinical practice. There is a really wonderful paper that was written in 2025, How to Write a Scientific Paper in 15 Steps. I recommend this paper if you're writing a paper for the first time because it helps you with the structure and flow of the process of writing the paper, and it gives you a logical approach. It's not the only way to write a paper, but it helps. If you are publishing anything related to clinical trials, observational studies, systematic reviews, any laboratory analysis, there are often standardized reporting guidelines. These are such helpful guidelines. So the Equator Network is the website where you can find most of these. What these provide is a checklist for things that should be included in a paper describing a study of a particular type. So for instance, if you have conducted a randomized clinical trial, you would follow the consort checklist. Along with the checklist, there are shorter and longer explanatory documents to give you background and examples on all of the checklist items that might want to be included. These checklists are incredibly helpful for writing the paper because they tell you what needs to be included, but they're also helpful for planning the study because they tell you what is going to be expected in the write-up, which tells you what things you need to record as you're doing them so that you can make sure you have all of that information. This is an example of the PRISMA checklist. This is the checklist for standardized reviews and meta-analyses. And you'll see the sorts of items and descriptions that might be included in a checklist. And it's usually organized by the section of the paper. So for instance, if you're writing a systematic review paper, you have to identify that it is a systematic review in the title. They have a specific checklist just for abstracts. And then in the introduction, you have to provide your rationale and then an explicit statement of the objective or the question that you're addressing, and so on and so on. So these checklists, they give you a little bit of information on where this information should be and what it should include. And if you want to go to the explanatory documents, they'll provide more information and those examples. One of the things that these checklists provide is also the flowchart for your inclusion criteria for different types of studies. So on the left, we have the PRISMA flowchart for the systematic review. And so you see that there's an identification section where you're saying how many records were identified in which databases, and you're going to fill out the numbers. On the right-hand side is a typical flowchart for a standardized trial, a clinical trial, where you're going to report how many you assessed for eligibility, how many were excluded for various reasons, how many were randomized, how many were allocated to each intervention, how many didn't receive it or did receive it, how many were lost to follow-up, and how many were in the final analysis, and who was excluded for what reasons. So these kinds of flowcharts have made reading standardized reporting guideline-based documents so much easier for those of us who do research synthesis where we're doing literature reviews, because we can read all of the information that we might need in one place. I also highly recommend using these flowcharts in writing up your report because they help everybody to understand who is in this study. So, you have written your manuscript and you're ready to submit it for publication. In the submission process, any journal that you select will have guidelines for authors. It could be labeled instructions for authors, guidelines for authors, authors page. Follow those guidelines. They may tell you they want single spaced, but usually double spaced, whether or not they want line numbers or page numbers, what other documents they want uploaded. For some, they will require that you include your consort checklist if you have done a clinical trial. So they want the checklist to say which page do we find this information on. On the submission portal, you will then upload your manuscript and any other documents. including figures and tables formatted per the guidelines for authors. And you may have to also enter in information. Among the information you might have to enter is the names, affiliations, and addresses of every single co-author. You may need to add ethical information or funding information. The amount that you need to enter in the submission portal varies from journal to journal. And once you have uploaded and entered all of the information, you will get to review the proof of the submitted manuscript before you hit the final submit button. Check your proofs. Nothing worse as a reviewer than getting a paper to review and finding that, well, 3 of the figures didn't actually render properly, so I can't even see them. So check the proofs, make sure that everything's there, make sure that it looks good, and then hit submit. And then wait. Review can take time. As an editor, sometimes I struggle with finding reviewers for papers, and it can take weeks. Most journals require that at least 2 of your peers review each document that you submit every time that you submit it. And people are busy, as you may know. So it can take time to find 2 peers to review. Sometimes if the 2 disagree, I will be looking for a 3rd reviewer, which takes more time. Sometimes it may just be months to find a reviewer. Wait. I generally say wait at least 3 months before you contact the editor to say what's going on with my paper. I generally will wait longer. My students usually don't let me, so it's up to you whether or not you want to reach out. If it's been 6 months, definitely reach out to the editor and ask what's going on. When you do get your reviews back, you will have comments from the reviewers. You will need to provide a point-by-point response to each of the comments that the reviewers have made. Usually, just start a Word document with all of the comments from reviewers, and for each comment, add in below your response. And then when you're working on your manuscript based on the reviewer's comments, use track changes. Almost every journal wants a track changes version as well as a clean version when you're submitting a revision. Finally, when it comes to publication, when congratulations, you've been accepted, you have to make some decisions. The first is whether or not you will publish open access. So open access allows people to read the article whether or not they have a subscription to that journal. Usually costs a bit more. Some journals are only open access, so if you have chosen that journal, you've already made that choice. APC, or page charges, are the fees for publishing with a journal. Check before you submit that you can afford the fees associated with a journal. They can be quite extensive. Also check if your institution has an agreement that will lower or completely do away with those fees, and check if your society, any of your professional societies, may have a similar agreement. Finally, after you've been accepted for publication, you will be asked to review proofs of your copy, edited, and typeset manuscript. So this is what the paper will look like when it is actually published. Please do check the proofs. Read through, make sure nothing serious was changed. Usually they will highlight where they have made changes. I do recommend that you check all of those. I recently had a copy editor change the species name of a tick to a non-vector insect, which was not quite appropriate, so I had to change that back. They will also often ask you a few questions. At the very minimum, they will ask you to verify the names of the authors because they want those to be absolutely accurate for indexing purposes. So you will need to go through that proof and check off, answer all the questions, check that it looks appropriate, that everything is included, and then you hit submit, and then you are published. This whole process can take anywhere from 1 month if it's fast and if you go through the review process very quickly, to I've had it take 18 months to 2 years, because sometimes you don't get reviews back from the first journal or 3. Sometimes you get reviews back and it's rejected and you have to try a new journal. Sometimes it takes 6 months to get reviews back And it's a long process to go through 2 or 3 rounds of 6 months of waiting for reviews. So understand that it can take time. If it is possible for you and it is common in your field, I recommend submitting a preprint at the time of submitting your paper for publication. The preprint allows the information to be out there without jumping ahead of your publication in any way. But do check that preprints are allowable by that journal. I have recently had a journal come back and say, you didn't cite the preprint, we don't accept that. So be aware of what goes into it. And as always, it takes time, it takes effort. Reach out to friends and colleagues to help you through the process, and good luck.